Okay, this is the first official video of my personal project to really make work that I'm proud of. Let's talk about the very first step that's necessary in reaching any kind of goal with your artwork. This is a step that I put all my students through. This is also a step that I really need to start with, whether it's for this particular project or any goal that I might have with my painting. So I need to start by getting really clear on what kind of work that I want to make. So to do this, I'm kind of checking in with my inspiration board here, and that's what you're taking a look at. This is my curated inspiration board. This is an assignment that I've talked about here on YouTube before. If you want to check out more about like how I put this together and how I use this board, I will link to previous videos in the upper right hand corner. But for now, I want to talk about how this is going to be the springboard off of which I build the rest of this journey, this particular project that I'm embarking on. And this project is to really create consistency in my painting practice, to have a body of work to show for it, and also to make sure that I'm making work that I'm really excited by. If you notice some of the work that's behind me here, overall, I would say it's pretty consistent. People recognize it as my work. And there are paintings in here that have been made in very different ways. And I think you can kind of see some of that reflected in the variety that I have in this inspiration board. I have this whole kind of section in the middle here that's dedicated to Carolyn Anderson's work. And those pieces are made with a fairly different technique than, say, some of the pieces by Daniel Keyes, by Nick Alm, by Francis Bell, especially when we look at some of the painters who are more inspired by Richard Schmid and Richard Schmid's way of working. These are very different techniques of building up a painting on the canvas. So I want to talk through what I notice here and what I'm noticing in my own work. So one of the most recent things that I noticed was how much success I was set up for in terms of my reference. When I take a look at, and for the sake of this conversation, I'm going to omit drawings. I'm going to look at paintings that are in full color because I think it'll make this conversation a little bit easier. So when I take a look at some of these portraits that are in color here, there's a pretty consistent breakdown of what percentage of the face is in light versus what's in the shadow, and how obvious that distinction between light and shadow is. It might be somewhat arbitrary, but I can still, with a good degree of confidence, place a dividing line between light and shadow down these faces. And I will sometimes get myself into trouble when I intentionally paint off a reference where the entire face is in shadow. Something not unlike the mother figure or more maternal figure that we have in this particular piece. You can tell by some of the color and light cues on the infant's face that the woman's face here, or the girl's face here, is almost entirely in shadow. That for me is a very, very tricky setup. It's not that it can't be done, but I do notice that I get into more trouble in that sense. So as I scroll through here, by and large, I want to be mindful of what this lighting setup really does look like for the vast majority of these portraits. In this painting that I just pulled up is one exception to the general lighting rule that I have. I think one other thing of note is that this piece and then this piece, which also has a face that's almost entirely in shadow, both of them have a lot more happening visually in the rest of the painting that I think offsets this a little bit. So there's a lot of light in the clothing here, and we have a little bit more of the figures, and then this painting has two full figures that do actually capture quite a bit more light. So I need to be mindful of that when I'm choosing reference. The next really big thing is I essentially need to make a decision between wanting to start my paintings with a more Carolyn Anderson style block-in versus doing what I'm going to refer to as a Richard Schmid style block-in. Unfortunately, I only think I have an image of Carolyn Anderson's work when it's in progress here. And this is not a Richard Schmid piece. It's a piece by Daniel Keyes, but it does show a little bit more of that approach where you start with a much wetter canvas. So specifically, I might start with a Gamsol wash, and I don't have as many kind of scumbly expressive brush marks down in the very beginning. So just like quickly compare what we see in this Daniel Keyes piece to what we see in the Carolyn Anderson piece. I need to effectively make a choice between these two for the sake of really solidifying my way of working. And what's really difficult here is that there's this psychological pull to do things that are new, things that are fresh, things that are exciting. And right now, this approach is a bit more comfortable to me. I've been doing it for a while. I can adapt it to something like what we have in this Nick Alm piece. But starting a piece more like this, it feels interesting because I don't understand it as well. I don't have as much time with it. And I think a lot of us experience this pull where after we've tried a particular technique, we immediately get pulled into, okay, well, I've done that thing now, so let's go ahead and explore the next technique. And that's such a recipe for really never letting yourself get as good as you want to. We need to focus on one thing long enough to really achieve mastery of it. If we keep setting our sights on something new, we're going to be a jack of all trades and a master of none, which, if you really want to make work at a masterful level, and of course there are different degrees of that, but if mastery is your goal, or working at a really exciting professional level is your goal, we need to give ourselves enough time with really one way of working. And that's not to say that we can't branch out and experiment, but we need it to be off of a really high-level foundation first. And that high-level foundation requires consistency. It requires sticking with something, even when it might start to feel a little bit boring. It's up to us to figure out ways to keep it exciting rather than constantly setting our sights on something new and shiny. And I am not exempt from this, which is why this is what we're talking about today. So, if I take a look at this board and I ask myself what I want to do next, I can kind of think about answering this question a couple of different ways. One is that I can ask myself what's exciting on this board. I can ask myself what I'm already comfortable doing. I can also ask myself which of these pieces could I set up? Could I compose on my own? Which do I understand well enough to put into practice for myself? So really quickly, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to disqualify a lot of the landscape pieces on this board, or you could say that I'm disqualifying all of them, because I am a portrait painter. This is my wheelhouse. I absolutely love so many of these landscape paintings, but the reality is that going out and scouting locations like these isn't going to be something that I have the bandwidth for right now. So I'm not going to let myself get distracted by these pieces at the moment. I can always work my way toward these pieces later. So with that being said, we know that the goal is going to be portraiture. So we've settled on a subject. The next thing that comes to mind is that there are a few different ways of working on this board. I have a few pieces by Frances Bell on here, which I absolutely love. She just has this really beautiful Sargent-like way of working. I think it's easy to see why when you take a look at the textiles that are used here and the ways in which they play with light on this particular piece. But it's also in just how chunky and decisive so many of these decisions are, and how masterful her knowledge of edges really is. She has a pretty wet way of working overall that I'm really drawn to, and things tend toward something that's a little bit more pastel. Let me see if I have some other examples of her work on this board. Here's an example of a Frances Bell piece that really illustrates what I mean by this. It's a little bit difficult to see when we're zoomed in here so intensely, but she tends to really hold back on her dark values. This is especially clear, I think, when you look at her starts, so the earlier phases of some of her paintings. You can tell that she really reserves the darks and puts them in at the very end. So going back to this particular piece, there's a lot of areas where we're really well aware that something is in the dark, such as under the jaw here or in the eye socket area. It very clearly reads as dark because of her control of her values and because of her control of her edges. But it would be so tempting for so many of us to go really, really dark here. And overall, I'd say there's a little bit more of a pastel feeling in her shadows that I'm just really drawn to. I love how she reserves those darks. I love the wetness of the brushwork and the texture of the piece overall, but she doesn't ever wander into overworking. It's so clean and so decisive with her brushwork. Now, next, I just love this Daniel Keyes close-up where you can see just how brushy and evocative his brushwork is without needing to be overwrought, overworked, overly literal. I would say Daniel overall has a process that I think would be very compatible with Francis Bell's way of working. I'd say overall, this particular piece looks much thinner. I don't see the same degree of impasto that I see in Francis's work, although I would say they are very closely related. And then going into this Nick Alm piece, again, we have some very thin wet brushwork here with the shadow shapes, and then we build up a little bit more impasto, a little bit more opacity, a little bit more thickness as we get into the light. I don't see a ton of dry brush except for really just the edges of the darks here and how they interact with the canvas behind. We can really contrast this with the approach that I see to Carolyn Anderson's portraits. Almost everything in here is dry, and we only start to get some of that like creamier, wetter feeling as the paint layer is just built up more. So there's some definite places where I see a bit more wetness in the paint by the time we have a finished composition like this one for Carolyn, but the method of getting here, I would say, is quite different. And I really need to make a decision here. Which way do I really want to work? And I think part of this is asking myself the question of what I'm drawn to. And I think the main thing that really speaks to me about all of these pieces is they have a very playful and experimental approach with edges. Not being afraid to literally push the boundaries. It is not necessarily clear exactly where the edge of this portrait is, but nonetheless, we have such a clear three-dimensional sense of it through looking at it. And I might not have the same energetic brushwork in the start of something like this Daniel Keyes piece. I can certainly see the implications of it a little bit, but it is a little bit more contained, a little bit more literal. And the reality is that I can play with those kinds of marks regardless of how wet the canvas is. Another example to look at here would be this Kwang Ho racehorse piece. We can tell the canvas is dry. I don't see any evidence of like a Gamsol wash underneath. I don't see a lot of these marks bleeding into any underlayer, so probably safe to assume that this was all very dry, but we nonetheless don't have quite the same degree of dry brush marks. The paint overall looks like it's gliding a little bit better, or at least a little bit more smoothly, I should say, on the canvas here. And that's probably achieved through having a different consistency with the paint in the first place, but nonetheless, just this idea of using the marks to really capture the gesture or the energy of a particular composition or a particular subject is something that I see myself drawn to over and over again. So from here, there's a couple things that I can do. One would be, if I know that what I'm really interested in is that energetic gestural line work, I can actually simplify this a little bit by taking a step back from painting and exploring this in dry media. I can do this in my sketchbook, I can do it on a big charcoal pad, and I think what I'm going to consider my next step is I want to experiment with a couple different ways of building up an image that still really emphasizes that playful relationship with line. So I might do this a little bit in drawing. I might do this with a little bit more of like the wet into wet Richard Schmidt approach. I might try this with a little bit more of a dry brush scumbly Carolyn Anderson approach. But either way, I'm really excited about this. So my next step is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to plan some pieces that I will be diving into next time that I am in the studio. If you have any questions about how I use this Pinterest board to guide my decision-making process, or you feel yourself stuck in a certain place with your own work and would like the same kind of help, check out the link in the description below to find out more about my mentorships, as well as to follow the link to apply to see if we are a fit to work together. If you are stuck in your own painting process in a similar way, if you find yourself bouncing between styles, between techniques, and not really making the progress you want with any one of them, make sure to check out the link in the description below to find out more about my mentorships and apply to see if we are a fit to work together, because this is exactly the kind of help that I give artists all the time, and I'm so glad that I can share just a taste of what this process looks like for you here on YouTube. But I am at my happiest when I get to work one-on-one with you to help you achieve your goals. So if that's something you're interested in, I'm super excited to hear from you.